the land that would become a nation. Before anyone ever called it America, before ships from Europe dared to sail its eastern coasts, this vast land pulsed with life in ways most people today can scarcely imagine. Towering forests stretched for hundreds of miles, rivers ran thick with fish, and grasslands waved under the winds like oceans of green. Mighty mountains and rolling plains were home to civilizations whose names are now whispered only in history books. The Mississippians building Cahokia, with its monumental mounds rising above the Mississippi River. The ancestral Puebloans crafting intricate cliff dwellings in the deserts of the Southwest. The Iroquois Confederacy weaving alliances and diplomacy across the dense forests of the Northeast. It was a world where the rhythms of life were dictated not by clocks or markets, but by the seasons, the migrations of animals, and the cycles of the sun and moon. And yet, it was also a land brimming with ambition, creativity, and the same restless spirit that would, centuries later, fuel the creation of a nation unlike any other. In the centuries to come, explorers from across the Atlantic would arrive, driven by dreams of wealth, empire, and discovery. They would encounter peoples who,
long before the first European ships appeared on the horizon, North America was a mosaic of civilizations, each uniquely adapted to its environment. In the fertile valleys of the Mississippian culture flourished. Around the year 1050 CE, the city of Cahokia emerged as the largest urban center north of Mexico, home to as many as 20,000 people, a metropolis by the standards of its time. Its central feature, Monk's Mound, rose over 100 feet high and covered 14 acres of earth, a testament to the organizational skill, engineering knowledge, and religious devotion of its builders. Archaeologists have discovered that Cahokia was not just a city, but a hub of trade, culture, and political power, with roads stretching for miles and goods flowing in from distant regions, including shells from the Gulf of Mexico and copper from the Great Lakes. Far to the southwest, in what is now New Mexico and Arizona, the ancestral Puebloans were constructing vast complexes of cliff dwellings, such as those at Mesa Verde. Using stone and adobe, they carved homes into the cliffs, often high above canyon floors, protecting themselves from enemies and harsh elements. These dwellings were not just homes, they were centers of community life, containing ceremonial kivas, storerooms, and intricate irrigation systems that allowed crops to thrive in arid landscapes. In the forests of the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy exemplified political sophistication. Long before European philosophers debated democracy, the Iroquois had established a union of 6 nations, governed by councils and guided by principles of consensus, diplomacy, and collective responsibility. Their influence stretched across vast territories, shaping trade, war, and culture in the region. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Northwest, communities thrived on the abundance of the sea. People built wooden longhouses, created totem poles that recorded myths, history, and lineage, and developed techniques for salmon fishing that sustained generations. The wealth of these regions was measured not in gold or land, but in culture, skill, and community. Yet the arrival of Europeans would irrevocably alter this landscape. The first explorers, Spanish, French, and English, would arrive with ships, weapons, and diseases. The newcomers carried visions of empire, conquest, and the extraction of wealth, setting the stage for centuries of change, often catastrophic, for the continent's original inhabitants. Still, these early civilizations left indelible marks, roads that would become trails, crops that would spread across continents, and traditions that survive today in languages, art, and cultural memory. The America that would emerge centuries later was built upon these foundations, a fusion of indigenous ingenuity and the relentless drive of those who crossed the ocean seeking a new world. By the early 1500s, explorers like John Cabot, Juan Ponce de Leon, and Jacques Cartier began charting the coasts of North America. Their expeditions were filled with uncertainty, danger, and sometimes glory, but they also heralded the start of a global collision that would reshape the continent forever. This sets the stage for colonial America, European settlement, and the early struggles that led to the creation of the United States.
The Atlantic Ocean was a vast and unforgiving barrier, stretching thousands of miles and filled with peril. Yet it could not deter the ambition of European powers in the 16th century. Spain, France, and England were locked in a race for exploration, wealth, and dominion, each believing that the uncharted lands across the Atlantic held not just riches, but destiny itself. In 1492, Christopher Columbus had crossed the ocean under the Spanish flag, though he landed in the Caribbean and not on the mainland. His voyages ignited an age of exploration that would sweep across the continent, forever altering the lives of its inhabitants. By the early 1500s, Spanish explorers, or conquistadores, had reached the southern reaches of North America. Hernando de Soto, in particular, carved a path of both discovery and devastation, wandering through the Mississippi Valley in search of gold. His expedition left an enduring legacy, not just in maps and tales, but in the catastrophic impact on native populations, whose numbers were decimated by disease and violence. Meanwhile, in the north, French explorers sought a different prize. Jacques Cartier sailed the St. Lawrence River in 1534, claiming vast territories for France, establishing trade networks, and fostering alliances with native tribes such as the St. Lawrence Iroquoians. The French approach relied heavily on cooperation and commerce rather than conquest, leading to enduring relationships and cultural exchange, particularly through the fur trade that would define much of the northern colonies for generations. By the early 1600s, England had also entered the race. The founding of Jamestown in 1607 marked the beginning of permanent English settlement in what would become the United States. Life in Jamestown was brutal. Disease, famine, and conflict with native peoples tested the settlers' endurance. Yet out of this struggle emerged the seeds of a new society. The cultivation of tobacco, pioneered by John Rolfe, transformed the colony's economy, linking it to global markets and laying the foundation for an agrarian society dependent on labor, first indentured servants and eventually enslaved Africans. New England would follow shortly thereafter, driven not just by economic ambition but by religious fervor. In 1620, the Pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower, seeking freedom from persecution in England. Their settlement at Plymouth Bay became emblematic of a different vision for America, one rooted in self-governance, community, and a covenant with God. Over time, the Massachusetts Bay Colony and other New England settlements would create thriving towns, schools, and trade networks, balancing religious ideals with practical survival in a harsh land. Across the Atlantic coast, the dynamics of colonization were complex. The Dutch, for example, established New Netherland, centered on present-day New York City. Trade and profit were paramount, and the colony became a melting pot of languages, cultures, and religions. English colonists would eventually seize it in 1664, renaming it New York, but the legacy of diversity and commerce persisted. Life in the colonies was shaped not just by European ambitions, but by the land itself. Harsh winters, fertile rivers, and sprawling forests demanded adaptation. Colonists learned from Native Americans, agricultural techniques such as planting corn with beans and squash, hunting skills, and local medicinal knowledge, even as tensions and violence sometimes erupted over land and resources. Yet the colonies were not uniform. In the south, plantations dominated the landscape, with cash crops like tobacco, rice, and later cotton defining economies and social hierarchies. In the north, small farms, towns, and burgeoning trade networks created a more diversified economy, with shipping, fishing, and craftsmanship thriving along the Atlantic seaboard. By the late 1600s, a sense of shared experience was emerging among the colonies. They were geographically distant from England, yet increasingly connected through trade, ideas, and the press. Early assemblies, town meetings, and local governance planted the seeds of political consciousness. Colonists began to see themselves not merely as transplanted Europeans, but as members of a unique, growing society. A society that valued self-reliance, liberty, and the capacity to govern itself. But beneath this growing sense of identity lay tensions that would eventually ignite a revolution. Religious differences, economic disputes, and competition for land created fault lines within and between colonies. And while the Atlantic Ocean provided a sense of distance from the crown, it could not shield the colonies from the influence of European politics, mercantile policies, or the ambitions of kings and parliaments. In these early decades, America was being forged, not in a single event, but through decades of struggle, adaptation, and contact between peoples of diverse cultures. The story of colonization was not one of uniform conquest or harmonious settlement. It was a tapestry of survival, negotiation, betrayal, and resilience. And as the 18th century dawned, this tapestry would begin to unravel in ways that few could predict, leading the 13 colonies toward the most dramatic and transformative event in their young history, the American Revolution.
The dawn of the 18th century found Britain's 13 colonies firmly established along the Atlantic coast. From the rocky shores of Massachusetts to the fertile fields of Georgia, towns were growing, ships were sailing, and trade was booming. The colonies were young, vigorous, and proud of their industrious spirit. Yet beneath the apparent calm of prosperity, something profound was stirring. A new consciousness that would transform these settlements into a nation. At first glance, the colonies appeared loyal to their mother country. They drank British tea, read London newspapers, and proudly called themselves Englishmen. But over time, distance bred independence. The Atlantic Ocean was not merely a body of water. It was a vast psychological gulf. Messages from London took months to arrive. Colonial assemblies had long been used to governing their own affairs, electing representatives, and managing local economies. Freedom, not as rebellion, but as practicality, had become a way of life. The British Empire, however, viewed its colonies through a different lens, as sources of wealth and power. The mercantilist system ensured that the colonies existed to enrich the crown, supplying raw materials and purchasing finished goods from England. The Navigation Acts of the 17th century enforced this vision, regulating trade and forbidding colonists from trading freely with other nations. Smuggling became a way of life. Independence, an economic necessity. But it was not just economics that fueled change. The Age of Enlightenment was sweeping across Europe, and its ideas reached American shores with astonishing force. Thinkers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau questioned monarchy, privilege, and divine authority. They proposed radical notions that government derived its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, that all men were endowed with natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and that tyranny was not to be endured, but resisted. In coffee houses and taverns from Boston to Philadelphia, these ideas were discussed, debated, and absorbed. Pamphlets circulated widely. The printing press became the great weapon of the mind. It was in this environment that figures like Benjamin Franklin, the printer-turned-philosopher, rose to prominence. Franklin's wit and wisdom symbolized the new American spirit, practical, skeptical, and inventive. He was an embodiment of the Enlightenment in motion, proving that through reason and effort, man could rise from humble beginnings to greatness. The first great test of colonial unity came not from Britain's policies, but from its wars. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, the North American theater of the global 7 Years' War, pitted Britain and its colonial militias against France and its Native American allies. It was a brutal, sprawling conflict that raged across the frontier. Young George Washington, then, a 22-year-old Virginia officer, made his first mark on history during this war, learning the lessons of command, courage, and the cost of empire. When Britain emerged victorious, it controlled nearly all of North America east of the Mississippi. But victory came at a staggering cost. The British treasury was drained, and Parliament sought to replenish it, not from the homeland, but from the colonies that had benefited from the war. Thus began the chain of events that would ignite revolution. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the spark. For the first time, Parliament imposed a direct tax on printed materials in the colonies, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. To the British, it was a fair measure to share imperial expenses. To the colonists, it was an outrage. They had no representatives in Parliament, no voice in the decision. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry. Protests erupted from New England to the Carolinas. Effigies of tax collectors were burned in the streets. The Sons of Liberty, led by fiery figures like Samuel Adams, organized boycotts and resistance. The act was repealed the following year, but the damage was done. The colonists had tasted the power of unity. The next decade saw a steady escalation. The Townshend Acts of 1767 placed duties on imports like glass, paper, and tea. The colonists responded with defiance. In 1770, tension boiled over in Boston when British soldiers, jeered by a crowd, opened fire, killing 5 men in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere's famous engraving of the event, dramatized for propaganda, spread outrage throughout the colonies. 3 years later, the Tea Act reignited the fury. The East India Company, struggling financially, was granted a monopoly on tea sales in America. Colonists saw it as a symbol of tyranny. On a cold December night in 1773, a group of patriots disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. An act of rebellion that would echo through history as the Boston Tea Party. Britain's response was swift and harsh. The coercive acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston's port, stripped Massachusetts of self-government, and allowed British soldiers to be quartered in colonial homes. Far from crushing resistance, these measures united the colonies in outrage. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, a meeting that would change everything. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, and John Adams debated their next steps. Some called for reconciliation, others for resistance. "I am not a Virginian, but an American," declared Patrick Henry. It was a radical statement, one of the first to suggest that the colonies' identities might merge into something new. By the spring of 1775, the tension reached its breaking point. British troops marched toward Concord, Massachusetts, to seize colonial arms. In the early dawn of April 19th, at Lexington Green, they were met by a small band of militia, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers. A single shot rang out. The shot heard round the world. The revolution had begun.
It began with smoke rising over the green fields of Massachusetts, and it would end with a new world order. When the British soldiers marched back from Concord that April morning in 1775, they were met with volleys of musket fire from behind stone walls and trees. By the time they returned to Boston, hundreds were dead or wounded. The rebellion that Britain had hoped to crush in a single display of force had instead ignited into a wildfire of defiance. Across the colonies, bells rang, militias assembled, and a cry of liberty echoed from New England to Virginia. At first, few imagined independence. The colonists still thought of themselves as British subjects demanding their rights, not as revolutionaries seeking to destroy an empire. But as blood was spilled, the path of reconciliation narrowed. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. It was here that the men who would shape America's destiny gathered once more. John Adams, the brilliant lawyer from Massachusetts; Thomas Jefferson, the eloquent Virginian; Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman and sage; and George Washington, tall, composed, and already admired for his integrity. Washington was soon appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, an army that barely existed. It was an army without uniforms, without supplies, without even shoes. Yet Washington accepted the task not for glory, but for duty. The cause, he said, is just, and therefore we must not fail. The early battles tested that resolve. In June 1775, colonial forces fortified Breed's Hill overlooking Boston Harbor. When the British attacked, wave after wave of redcoats climbed the hill under heavy fire. The Americans, short on ammunition, waited until their enemies were close enough to see their faces before firing. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," became the battle cry of the day. Though the colonists ultimately retreated, the Battle of Bunker Hill proved that American courage could match British might. Meanwhile, pamphlets and newspapers stirred the public's imagination. No work did this more effectively than Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776. In simple, searing language, Paine tore down the idea of monarchy and called for complete independence. "'Tis time to part," he wrote. "The cause of America is the cause of all mankind." The pamphlet sold over 100,000 copies, an astonishing number for the era, and transformed colonial anger into revolutionary conviction. By the summer of 1776, there was no turning back. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, it proclaimed to the world that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. The document was both a philosophical masterpiece and a declaration of defiance. For the first time in history, a people were claiming the right to form a nation on the basis of liberty, not lineage. But the idealism of the Declaration soon met the harsh realities of war. The British responded with overwhelming force. That same year, a massive fleet arrived in New York Harbor, the largest armada Britain had ever assembled. The city became a battlefield. Washington's poorly trained troops were driven from Long Island and across New Jersey, pursued relentlessly by the British. By December, the revolution seemed doomed. Then came one of the most audacious moments in American history. On Christmas night, 1776, in a freezing blizzard, Washington led his army across the icy Delaware River. By dawn, they surprised the Hessian mercenaries at Trenton, capturing nearly 1,000 soldiers.
The victory electrified the colonies. "These are the times that try men's souls," Thomas Paine had written, and now the Americans had proven that courage could triumph over despair. The war dragged on for years, brutal, uncertain, and often desperate. In 1777, the Americans won a crucial victory at Saratoga, where General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold forced the surrender of a British army. The victory convinced France that the American cause could succeed. In 1778, the French formally allied with the United States, bringing naval power, money, and soldiers. The revolution had now become a global conflict. Yet hardship remained constant. At Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington's armies suffered unimaginable privation, frostbite, hunger, and disease. Many soldiers had no shoes, wrapping their feet in rags as they left bloody footprints in the snow. Yet Washington's leadership never faltered. He rode among his men, offering words of encouragement, sharing their suffering. With the help of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who drilled the ragtag troops into a disciplined fighting force, the army emerged stronger than ever. By April 1781, the tide had turned. The decisive moment came at Yorktown, Virginia, where British General Cornwallis found himself trapped between Washington's forces on land and the French fleet at sea. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. The cannons fell silent, and the dream of American independence had become a reality. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, formally ended the war. Great Britain recognized the sovereignty of the United States, ceding territory from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. When Washington resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon, King George III reportedly asked what he would do next. The answer came, he will return to his farm. "If he does that," said the astonished king, "he will be the greatest man in the world." The revolution was not merely a war for independence. It was a revolution of ideas. It challenged the oldest order on earth, monarchy, hierarchy, and inherited privilege, and declared that ordinary people could govern themselves. But it was also incomplete. The promise of equality did not yet extend to all. Enslaved Africans remained in bondage, women had no political voice, and Native Americans faced new waves of displacement. The ideals of 1776 were bold, but the struggle to realize them would take centuries. Still, the world had changed forever. A new nation had been born, fragile, experimental, and radiant with hope.
The guns had fallen silent, but peace brought new trials. The United States had won its independence. Now it had to prove it could govern itself. In 1783, as the last British troops departed New York, General George Washington returned to Mount Vernon, a weary but revered man. His soldiers adored him, the people trusted him, and even his enemies respected him. Yet the nation he had fought for was fragile, a patchwork of 13 states, each jealously guarding its sovereignty, tied together by the weak Articles of Confederation. The Articles, adopted in 1781, were born of fear of kings, armies, and tyranny. They created a government so limited that it could not levy taxes, regulate trade, or enforce laws. Congress could declare war but not raise the money to fight one. It could make treaties but not compel states to obey them. The new republic was free but rudderless. The post-war years revealed the danger. Soldiers went unpaid. Inflation soared. The economy faltered as British goods flooded American markets. Frontier settlements erupted in conflict with native nations, while states quarreled over boundaries and trade. In Massachusetts, economic despair boiled into rebellion. In 1786, a former army captain named Daniel Shays led angry farmers in armed protest against debt and taxation. They marched on courthouses, demanding relief. The rebellion was crushed, but it terrified leaders across the nation. What a triumph for our enemies to find that we are incapable of governing ourselves. The crisis demanded a bold solution. In the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia to amend the Articles. What they created instead was something revolutionary. A new constitution, a framework for a republic unlike any the world had seen. Inside Independence Hall, debates raged for months. The delegates, among them James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin, grappled with fundamental questions. How could power be strong enough to govern, yet limited enough to prevent tyranny? How could large and small states share authority? How could liberty and order coexist? Madison, slight and scholarly, drafted much of the document, drawing on Enlightenment ideas and the lessons of history. The result was a system of checks and balances, 3 branches of government, each restraining the others, a Congress to make laws, a president to enforce them, and a judiciary to interpret them. The Great Compromise balanced population-based representation in the House with equal representation for states in the Senate. But there were darker compromises too. To preserve unity, the framers allowed slavery to persist, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation. The question of freedom versus bondage was left unresolved, a time bomb that would haunt the nation for generations. When the Constitution was completed in September 1787, Benjamin Franklin, then 81 years old, gazed at the carved sun on the back of Washington's chair. He said, "I have often looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now I have the happiness to know it is a rising sun." The document went to the states for ratification, sparking fierce debate between Federalists, who supported the new government, and Anti-Federalists, who feared centralized power. The Federalist Papers, essays written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, argued eloquently that liberty required order, and that the Constitution was the surest safeguard of both. By 1789, the new government was born. The people unanimously chose George Washington as the first president of the United States. When he took the oath of office in New York City, then the nation's capital, he trembled with humility. He said, "I walk on untrodden ground. There is scarcely an action whose example may not hereafter be drawn into precedent." Washington's presidency was one of balance and restraint. He sought unity above all, surrounding himself with brilliant and often conflicting advisors. Alexander Hamilton, as Treasury Secretary, envisioned a strong federal government, a national bank, and an economy driven by industry. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, dreamed of an agrarian republic, where independent farmers sustained liberty through self-reliance. Their rivalry would give birth to the nation's first political parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Despite tension, Washington guided the fledgling nation through peril. He suppressed the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, proving that the new government could enforce its laws. He kept the nation neutral amid European wars, warning in his farewell address against entangling alliances and political faction. When he voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms, he set a precedent of peaceful transfer of power that would define American democracy. After Washington came John Adams, the blunt and principled patriot from Massachusetts. His presidency was marked by crisis with France, the quasi-war fought at sea, and by domestic controversy over the Alien and Sedition Acts, which punished dissent. These acts provoked outrage and fueled the rise of Jefferson's party, which championed states' rights and individual liberty. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States, the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing parties. "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," he declared in his inaugural address, seeking to heal divisions. Jefferson's presidency embodied both idealism and contradiction. He purchased the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803, doubling the size of the nation for $15 million, one of the greatest real estate deals in history. Yet the man who proclaimed all men are created equal continued to own enslaved people, a paradox that mirrored the young republic itself. Exploration followed expansion. In 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, commissioned by Jefferson, embarked on an expedition across the continent. Guided by Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman, they mapped rivers, mountains, and territories no American had ever seen. Their journey symbolized both the promise and peril of westward expansion, discovery for some, displacement for others. The early 19th century also saw the rise of new challenges abroad. American ships faced harassment from European powers, and sailors were seized into British service. These affronts, combined with a desire to assert national pride, led to the War of 1812. The young nation, still fragile, faced the might of the British Empire once more. Washington, D.C. was burned. The White House and Capitol lay in ashes. Yet out of the flames rose resilience. At Fort McHenry in Baltimore, American troops held firm against bombardment, inspiring Francis Scott Key to write The Star-Spangled Banner. The final victory at New Orleans, led by General Andrew Jackson, came after peace had been declared, but with something greater: a renewed faith in the nation's endurance. As the 1820s dawned, America stood transformed. Its population had soared. Canals and turnpikes linked distant regions. The frontier beckoned westward, and a spirit of possibility filled the air. Yet beneath the optimism ran deep contradictions. Freedom for some, bondage for others. Unity in law, division in practice. Still, to the rest of the world, the experiment had worked. A republic had survived where many expected it to collapse. The United States was no longer a fragile collection of states. It was a growing power, confident in its destiny.
A nation on the move. By the 1820s, America's population was surging, and its ambition was boundless. The Atlantic coast had grown crowded with towns and farms, and the call of the West echoed like a promise. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains lay rivers, forests, and open plains, land that seemed endless. Wagon wheels groaned over muddy trails. Families packed their entire lives into wooden carts, heading westward toward hope. From Kentucky to Missouri, from Tennessee to Texas, a restless generation chased a dream called manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were divinely destined to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. As they moved west, they carried with them both their ideals of freedom and their contradictions of bondage. For among the wagons rolled not only pioneers and preachers, but also slaveholders and enslaved men, women, and children, forced to march into new territories that promised liberty for some and chains for others. Frontier dreams and native tragedies. The land was not empty. It belonged to native nations, the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole in the South, the Sioux and Cheyenne in the Great Plains, the Apache and Navajo in the deserts of the Southwest.
But President Andrew Jackson, a hero of earlier wars, saw the native presence as an obstacle. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, ordering native tribes to leave their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi. Soldiers arrived, treaties were broken, and entire nations were forced to march west under military guard. The Cherokee called their deadly journey the Trail of Tears. More than 15,000 people were driven from their homes. Thousands perished along the way from hunger, cold, and disease. The frontier was expanding, but at a terrible human cost. The fire of reform. At the same time, a new moral awakening swept across the young republic. The Second Great Awakening, a powerful religious revival, inspired Americans to fight for social change. Preachers thundered from pulpits about sin and salvation, not only in heaven, but on earth. Reformers demanded temperance, women's rights, and most passionately, the end of slavery. Figures like Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave turned orator, spoke with thunder in his voice. "I would unite with anybody to do right and with nobody to do wrong." Harriet Tubman, born into slavery, became the Moses of her people, guiding hundreds to freedom through the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses stretching from the South to Canada. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that brought the horrors of slavery into every Northern home. One Southern critic called it a book that started a war. A house divided. As new states joined the Union, a burning question followed each one. Would it allow slavery or not? The Missouri Compromise in 1820 had tried to maintain a balance between free states and slave states, but expansion made this harder. The Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 let settlers decide for themselves, leading to violent clashes known as Bleeding Kansas. In 1857, the Supreme Court delivered its infamous Dred Scott decision, ruling that African Americans had no rights that white men were bound to respect. The nation's conscience split apart. Then came a tall, quiet lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. In 1858, he declared in a debate, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." When Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Southern leaders saw it as a direct threat to slavery. One by one, states seceded, South Carolina first, then Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, forming the Confederate States of America. The United States had fractured. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The sky glowed red with the first shots of the Civil War. Men rushed to enlist on both sides. The North fought to preserve the Union. The South fought for its independence and to protect the institution of slavery. Battles erupted across the continent: Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Shiloh. Fields once used for farming became fields of death. Families were torn apart, brothers fought against brothers, and cities burned. In 1863, after the bloody victory at Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate territory shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The war transformed from a battle for union into a crusade for freedom. Gettysburg and the Price of Union. In July 1863, two mighty armies collided at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For 3 days, thunder rolled across the hills, cannon, musket, and the cries of the wounded. When the smoke cleared, 50,000 men lay dead or wounded. Later that year, Lincoln stood on that blood-soaked ground and delivered words that would echo through eternity. that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The fall of the Confederacy. By 1865, the Confederate armies were exhausted, their cities in ruins. Union General Ulysses S. Grant pressed southward, while William Tecumseh Sherman's troops burned their way through Georgia in a brutal campaign known as the March to the Sea. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War, America's bloodiest conflict, was over. But victory carried heartbreak. Just days later, on April 14th, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington. The nation that had just survived its greatest trial now mourned its savior. A new birth of freedom. The Union was preserved, but the country that emerged was forever changed. 4 million enslaved men and women were free, at least in law. Yet the road to equality would be long, and the scars of war would not easily heal. From the ashes of conflict, a new America began to rise, stronger, freer, but still searching for the meaning of its own ideals. The Civil War had answered one question, that the United States would endure, but it left another to future generations. Could freedom and justice truly belong to all?
The Civil War had left the United States divided, scarred, and uncertain of its future. Cities lay in ruins, families were broken, and 4 million newly freed African Americans faced the daunting challenge of building new lives in a land that still struggled to accept their freedom. The Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877. When the guns fell silent in 1865, President Abraham Lincoln had envisioned a compassionate plan to heal the nation. But his assassination that same year plunged the country into political chaos. Under President Andrew Johnson and later Ulysses S. Grant, the federal government attempted to rebuild the South and redefine American democracy. Freedmen's Bureau agents fanned out across the South, helping formerly enslaved people find work, reunite with families, and establish schools. For the first time, African Americans held public office, from local councils to the U.S. Congress. Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce became the first black senators, symbolizing a new hope for equality. Yet resistance was fierce. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities, and Jim Crow laws soon emerged to enforce segregation. By 1877, when federal troops withdrew from the South, Reconstruction had ended, but the struggle for civil rights had only begun. The rise of industry and the Gilded Age. As the South rebuilt, the North transformed. The United States entered the Gilded Age, a time of dazzling wealth and deep inequality. Factories roared, railroads stretched from coast to coast, and new inventions reshaped daily life. Men like Andrew Carnegie, steel, John D. Rockefeller, oil, and J.P. Morgan, finance, built vast empires, becoming the first generation of American millionaires. To some, they were captains of industry. To others, robber barons. Their fortunes were built on hard labor and often on the backs of immigrants. Immigration and urban growth. Between 1870 and 1900, millions poured into the U.S. from Europe and Asia. Italians, Irish, Germans, Poles, and Chinese workers came seeking opportunity. They built railroads, mined coal, and crowded into city tenements. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh exploded with growth. Skyscrapers pierced the skyline, streetcars clanged through the streets, and electric lights turned night into day. Yet behind the progress lay poverty, disease, and exploitation. Child labor was rampant, and factory workers toiled for long hours in dangerous conditions.
innovation and change. Despite the hardships, this era also witnessed remarkable innovation. Thomas Edison lit up homes with the electric bulb. Alexander Graham Bell connected voices across continents with the telephone. Henry Bessemer's steel process revolutionized construction, making bridges and skyscrapers possible. America was no longer just a young republic, it was becoming an industrial powerhouse. The seeds of reform. By the century's end, a growing chorus of reformers began to challenge corruption and inequality. Journalists known as muckrakers exposed the dark side of industrial life, while labor unions fought for fair wages and safer conditions. The dream of freedom that had survived the Civil War was being tested again, not on the battlefield, but in factories, tenements, and political halls. In the ashes of war and the smoke of industry, a new America was being forged, one of steel, steam, and struggle. World wars, social change, and the rise of global influence. The dawn of the 20th century found America standing taller than ever before. Its factories thundered with production, its cities glimmered with electric light, and its people carried a growing sense of destiny. The nation that had once been a cluster of colonies now looked outward, confident and ambitious, ready to shape the modern world. A new century, a new power. By 1900, the United States was no longer an isolated republic across the Atlantic. It was an industrial giant. Steel, oil, and railroads had transformed its landscape, and titans like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford had become symbols of both innovation and excess. Immigrants poured through Ellis Island by the millions, seeking the American dream in a land of opportunity, though they often found crowded tenements and grueling factory work instead. President Theodore Roosevelt embodied the new American spirit, bold, assertive, and unafraid to challenge the world. His big stick diplomacy expanded U.S. influence abroad. The Panama Canal was carved through the jungles of Central America, linking the Atlantic and Pacific, and announcing America's arrival as a global power. In Asia and Latin America, the stars and stripes began to appear more often, on ships, in ports, and in policies. The U.S. had become not just a nation, but an empire of influence. The Great War, 1914 to 1918. When war erupted in Europe in 1914, America at first stood apart. President Woodrow Wilson urged neutrality, impartial in thought as well as in action. But the world was too interconnected for isolation. German submarines sank American ships, and telegrams revealed secret plots. By 1917, the United States entered what would later be called World War I, the war to end all wars. American soldiers, the doughboys, crossed the Atlantic, bringing fresh energy to weary Allied forces. Their courage at battles like Cantigny and the Argonne helped turn the tide. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. The war had cost millions of lives, but America emerged stronger, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. At the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson championed his vision of a League of Nations, a global organization to preserve peace. Yet back home, the Senate rejected it. The U.S. withdrew once more into itself, wary of entanglements in foreign wars. The Roaring Twenties. The 1920s roared with energy and excess. Radios crackled in living rooms, jazz filled smoky clubs, and cars rolled off Ford's assembly lines in endless streams. Women, having won the right to vote in 1920, cut their hair short, wore flapper dresses, and danced with a new sense of freedom. America was modern, and it was thriving. But beneath the glitter lay tension.
The economy soared on credit and speculation, while old values clashed with new ones. The Ku Klux Klan re-emerged, targeting immigrants and African Americans. The Scopes monkey trial pitted science against religion. And in 1929, the bubble burst. The Great Depression, 1929 to 1939. When the stock market crashed, millions of dreams crashed with it. Banks failed, factories closed, and bread lines stretched across city blocks. Farmers watched dust storms swallow their land in the Midwest, turning the Great Plains into a barren dust bowl. Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1933, promising a New Deal. His programs, from the Civilian Conservation Corps to the Social Security Act, gave hope to a struggling nation. Radio fireside chats made Americans feel that someone finally understood their pain. Slowly, painfully, the country began to recover. But even as America rebuilt, darkness spread across the globe. In Europe, Adolf Hitler's Germany rose in fury. In Asia, Japan's empire expanded with ruthless ambition. When war erupted again in 1939, America watched from afar until December 7, 1941, when Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor. A date which will live in infamy, Roosevelt declared. America was at war once more, this time across two oceans. Factories that had been idle roared to life, producing tanks, ships, and planes at record speed. Men went off to fight in Europe in the Pacific. Women took their place in the workforce, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. On the battlefields of Normandy, Iwo Jima, and the Ardennes, Americans fought with courage and sacrifice. By 1945, Nazi Germany had fallen, and the atomic bomb, a weapon of unimaginable power, brought Japan to surrender. The world was forever changed. The rise of a superpower. When the smoke cleared, much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins, but America stood tall, powerful, and unbroken. Its economy was booming, its military unmatched, and its influence global. From the ashes of war, the United States took on a new role, leader of the free world. It helped rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan, shaped the founding of the United Nations, and stood ready to defend democracy wherever it was threatened. The isolation of the past was gone. The 20th century would belong, for better or worse, to the United States of America.
Civil rights, the Cold War, culture, and technology. The guns of World War II fell silent in 1945, but America's new battlefields were no longer in Europe or the Pacific. They were ideological, cultural, and domestic. The United States emerged as a global superpower, confident yet cautious, carrying both the hopes and the fears of the modern age. The Cold War began. In the ashes of Berlin and the shadow of the atomic bomb, a new kind of war was born. One fought not with armies, but with ideas. The Cold War divided the world into two camps: democracy led by the United States and communism led by the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain fell across Europe. Berlin was split in two. Americans built bomb shelters, school children practiced duck and cover, and the race for nuclear dominance accelerated. The space race soon followed, reaching its peak in 1969 when American astronauts set foot on the moon, a triumph not just of technology, but of national pride. The Civil Rights Movement. At home, another revolution stirred, one of justice and equality. In the segregated South, brave men and women stood up to centuries of oppression. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marched with millions, preaching peace in the face of hate. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 changed the law, but the deeper struggle for equality would continue for generations. Vietnam and dissent. The 1960s also brought conflict abroad and division at home. The Vietnam War dragged on, claiming lives and faith in government. Young Americans protested in the streets, demanding peace, justice, and change. The counterculture arose, with rock music, long hair, and rebellion symbolizing a new generation unwilling to accept the old order. A changing nation. From the suburbs of the 1950s to the protests of the 1970s, America was transforming. Television brought world events into living rooms, shaping opinion and emotion. Technology surged, from color TV to the first computers. By the 1980s, America was vibrant yet divided, a nation of invention, conflict, and constant motion, poised to enter the digital age. Innovation, politics, social change, and the challenges of a new century. The 1980s opened with the promise of renewal. President Ronald Reagan declared it was morning again in America. The economy surged, Wall Street boomed, and computers began to reshape life and labor. The Cold War, long and exhausting, neared its end, culminating in 1989 when the Berlin Wall crumbled and the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States stood alone as the world's superpower. The digital revolution. In garages and college dorms, a new kind of revolution began, one driven by technology. Apple, Microsoft, and later Google and Amazon transformed how Americans worked, played, and connected. The internet linked the world. Social media amplified voices, and smartphones put the world in every hand. Politics and power. From Reagan to Clinton, Bush to Obama, American politics reflected both progress and polarization. The 1990s brought prosperity and peace. The 2000s began with tragedy. On September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks on New York and Washington shook the nation to its core. The war on terror reshaped foreign policy for decades to come. Social change and struggle. As the 21st century unfolded, Americans faced new questions of identity and justice. Movements for LGBTQ+ rights, racial equality, and gender justice reshaped the national conversation. The election of Barack Obama, the first African-American president, marked both progress and proof of how far the nation had come and how far it still had to go. The challenges of a new century. From economic recessions to global pandemics, from political division to climate crisis, the United States entered the 2020s tested but resilient. Innovation soared, from renewable energy to artificial intelligence, yet the debates over power, truth, and freedom continued. In the story of modern America, triumph and tension live side by side. The nation that began as an experiment in liberty now stands as a symbol of constant reinvention, still striving, still struggling, still dreaming.